through many trials. Jasmine Lee. Based on the true stories of Sang-ok Lee, Sun-sik Kim, Seok-hee Lee, Jung-bae Lee, and Eun-hee Park. Contents. Introduction. The Story of the Widow, page 1. To Want the World, page 4. Change in God, page 7. Never Giving Up, page 11. Rags to Riches, page 14. In conclusion, page 19. Introduction. When I first started the PBL project, I did not know what exactly I wanted to write about. What could possibly be interesting in the lives of my ancestors to my descendants? But as I prepared for and conducted my research, I saw how my and your ancestors lived through numerous hardships and trials that we cannot even imagine about. And so, this booklet is about the trials, struggles, and hardships that my grandparents and parents went through and how they fought through those struggles. It would also highlight what lessons we can learn from their lives. I sincerely hope that my writing would help you learn more about your ancestors and your own past, and that you will learn to love your own family. I sincerely Chapter 1. The Story of the Widow. My maternal grandmother, Sang-ok Lee, was a refugee from war. The Korean War, though it might sound like ancient history, actually broke out when she was a little child, maybe 3 or 4. As a little child, she escaped from North Korea with her parents and siblings on a boat. Their family settled in Busan, far away from their homeland. Unlike the poverty and struggles you might have expected her to face as a refugee, she grew up without much financial struggle. Her father, my great-grandfather, who had had a small shipbuilding business in North Korea, continued his business in the port city of Busan, and their family was one of the wealthiest in town. It was the mid-1900s, and they had televisions in their home. She grew up quite comfortably like that, and met my grandfather when she shortly lived in Ulsan, a nearby city. They got married and had 2 children, my aunt and my mother. And it seemed like happily ever after, until her husband passed away from an illness, leaving my grandmother a widow in her early 20s with 2 little children, each aged 4 and 2, to look after without her husband. So she moved back in with her parents, who were still quite wealthy from the shipbuilding business, and lived with them. They were one big family with not only them, but my grandmother's siblings also living in the house. And again, it seemed like now it was finally happily ever after. But then, poverty hit. My great-grandfather had been in the shipbuilding business, for which he had borrowed some money from his brother. But then, his brother and his son took my great-grandfather's business away for the loan he had been given. All of a sudden, my great-grandfather had lost his business and all his money to his brother and nephew. My grandmother recounts that her family had almost had to get out into the streets because of the sudden and extreme poverty they were hit with. Now, my grandmother had to move away from her parents and raise her 2 children by herself, without a husband or a family to help her. She did anything and everything for her 2 children, from packaging fish into boxes to cleaning boats. And she recalls that she did not even think about her life and her work being difficult because of her responsibilities as a mother of 2. It was the utmost priority for her to make sure that her 2 daughters had a better life than she had. And she lived like that, working hard, demanding perfection from herself, and trying her best. And she tried to rely on herself to go through all those struggles and trials. But then grandmother met God. One of her younger sisters, who had gone to college, met God and realized that the answer to all their problems and poverty was not to try harder and harder. It was to rely on God. And my grandmother says that meeting God brought her freedom from everything she required herself to be. And this is the lesson she wants us, her descendants, to remember. That tomorrow's worries are tomorrow's worries, and that they should bring those worries and concerns up to God, not to themselves. She says Matthew 6:34, which says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own," is her motto for life. Her hardships could not be overcome by all her efforts and work, no matter how much she tried. She tried her best to save herself and her family from the struggles they faced with her own power and her own efforts. But no matter how much she wanted to help her children, no matter how much she tried to work her life out as a widow, and no matter how hard she tried to work through the poverty she faced, only God could save her from it. and I wish that this lesson would live on in all of our lives. Work through the poverty she faced. Chapter 2, To Want the World. Growing up without a father is by no means easy, and it is even harder when your family is in poverty. My mother, Unhibak, was born and raised in Busan, and like you just read in the first chapter, her father passed away when she was barely 2. When she was a child, she was brought up in a wealthy family since it was before her grandfather's business was taken away. But after the family's shipbuilding business was stolen, her life also fell into poverty. Sure, Grandma worked hard for her daughters, but without a father or a family for support, my mother and her aunt's teenage lives were the best she could hope for. Growing up, her worst fear was someone finding out that she did not have a father and looking down on her for that. Just like my grandmother's life and perspective changed by meeting God, my mom also changed a lot and became a passionate Christian when she got saved as a teenager. But she recalls that her passion and love for God slowly faded away as she went through high school and university. Because she had seen the consequences of poverty and the gratifications of hard work, my mother's purpose in life was to study hard, get into a good college, and get a well-paying job to settle with. So during her high school years, she put everything into her studies. Her determination and her high goals succeeded, in a way, since she got into a top-notch university in Seoul. However, because she had only cared about getting into a good school, she had grown away from God. She started making excuses not to go to church and lost the passion she first had. When she moved away from grandmother to Seoul, she completely left God and the church. She encountered the beauties of and the wonders of Seoul and compared herself to her wealthy, pretty, and smarter friends at university. This made her see herself as a poor, fatherless girl from the countryside and completely destroyed her self-esteem. So, in Seoul, my mother was captivated by the world and its riches that she forgot all about God, her prior passion for Him, all forgotten. She thought that getting away from God would give her more freedom and would make her worldly life better. However, it only dragged her down into more misery as she felt the limits of herself without God. She was discouraged by how wealthy and luxurious her friends were, so she did not try hard in college for good grades. She did not attend church at all because she felt like God was doing nothing for her. She dated boys and went to prestigious schools and had wealthy parents, but each time, they never actually wanted a deep relationship with her. By the time she graduated from college, she did not know where her life was going. Even though she had majored in law at university, she could not study for the bar exams because of financial issues in her family, so she got a job right after graduating. And as she worked, she thought about where everything had started going wrong and realized that leaving God for the world had been the problem. So she returned to the church she had once abandoned for the world. My mother hopes that we, as her descendants, would not repeat the same mistake of straying away from God into the fancy illusion of the world. She says that to believe in God is to completely trust Him to lead you with His perfect plan. Even though the world may look attractive and appealing at the moment, you cannot know what will happen to you. She believes that trying our best in everything and trusting God to lead us is the biggest joy we can have in life. Even though she did not have a biological father, and she was taunted by the fact when she was younger, she now believes that her Father in heaven is her true Father. The world cannot fulfill you in the same way that God does. And perhaps the biggest takeaway lesson is that freedom and rest from your worries only come from relying on God, not from desiring the world. Is that Chapter 3, Change in God. Just like my maternal grandmother, my paternal grandfather's childhood tremendously changed with the Korean War. My grandfather, Seok Lee, was originally born to a wealthy noble family in Toledo in the late 1930s. His grandfather was the head of the village and their family was the richest in the village. Though he contracted polio as a child and limped on one leg, he lived a wealthy and comfortable childhood. However, during the Korean War, the communists from the north killed my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, and his brothers and bombed the inn they owned. Just like that, my grandfather had nothing left. No family, no money, no home. He was fortunately taken in by one of his relatives and was allowed to finish high school. After graduating, he moved to Seoul, hoping that working in Seoul would help with his finances. He and his brothers tried hard to make money working in factories, but they could barely make money to live on. One of his brothers even went to fight in the Vietnam War, but their lives were still in poverty. And then the factory he had been working in caught fire and had to close. During those hardships, he met grandmother and got married, but their economic situation improved by no means. My grandparents, my grandfather's brothers, and relatives all lived cramped in one tiny house. Even after getting 3 children, including my father, the family suffered from great poverty. They were so poor that they could not afford proper food. Grandfather tried many small businesses, but all of them failed. Devastated, he fell into horse racing and wasted money on bet. This cycle of poverty and gambling continued in a never-ending cycle. One day, my grandmother started going to church. Soon, she took him to a revival service in which he realized his sins and got saved. His salvation changed him 180 degrees. He had lived a life that was wasteful and without purpose. He could never earn much money, and that poverty led to even worse poverty. After losing his father, my grandfather had lived a difficult life leading to downfall. However, after meeting God, he stopped going to horse racings and his lifestyle completely changed. He had a purpose to live for and work diligently for his family. Grandfather says that he wants his descendants to remember him as someone who changed completely after meeting God. We can clearly see how his life seemed hopeless and so miserable before meeting God. However, after meeting God, he changed so much that even to this day, he loves God with all his heart. We can see how we can change so much by simply going out to God, and also how our lives can turn upside down from misery to salvation. I hope that this story encouraged all of us going through difficulties to come out to God for Him to change us in our lives, just like He did for my grandfather. Chapter 4, Never Giving Up. Now, this is the story of my other grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Sunshik Kim. Just like my grandfather that I just told you about, my grandmother was born to a wealthy family. She was born in 1940, and back then, Confucianism was the biggest tradition and culture in Korea. So, she grew up under the influence of Buddhist and Confucian ideas. She met grandfather through arranged marriage between their families because they were both born from rich families in the past. My grandfather was very good looking, yes, he was handsome, and my grandmother had only seen his face before marrying. However, she had not known that he also had polio when she married him and was extremely shocked after she learned the fact. Like the chapter before showed, my grandfather was not very wealthy, like grandmother's family was. Suddenly, by marrying my grandfather, grandmother became poor. She was from a wealthy family and grew up cared for, but now she couldn't even have 3 meals a day, did not have a proper home, and was totally alone. She was married by 27 and had my father a year later when she was just 28. However, grandmother did not give up and tried even harder to make her life a success. She raised 3 children, my father and 2 aunts, the best she could, even in difficult situations as a young woman. She worked as a housekeeper in wealthy families. It was draining and difficult, but she never gave up and did her best to save herself and her family. After meeting God, she lived even harder in the love of God for those she loved. She led her whole family to Christ to help them see the truth and love too. Even in difficulties and extreme poverty, grandmother tried her best to provide her children with a better life than the one she lived. When my dad was about to go into middle school, my grandmother and her relatives argued about his education. The relatives all said that my dad shouldn't go to middle school and should go work in a factory to earn money for the family. But my dad remembers grandmother shouting at them, saying she will send him to middle school no matter what. She knew that the family needed more money, but she wanted the best for her children even when it meant poverty and hardships at the moment. When my father was about to go to college, the family did not have enough money to pay for his tuition. Instead of giving up on hope, she called and begged the Scholarship Society for help. Eventually, she met a man who was willing to pay for my father's tuition, just like a miracle. She did everything she could for her children, and in the end, sent all 3 of her children to college. Obviously, my grandmother's life wasn't all sunshine and butterflies. She went from a child of a wealthy family to working as a housekeeper. However, she never lost hope and was persistent, diligent, and hardworking for her family that she loved so much. She wishes that we would always remember that there is nothing impossible, and that even in difficulties you will succeed if you try hard enough. Her life seemed hopeless and like a failure. Yet, she never gave up and persisted, just like we also should. Chapter 5, Rags to Riches. This chapter, focused on my dad's story, is the last chapter of this booklet and perhaps the most motivating if you are a student. If you read the previous 2 chapters, you would know how my grandparents, my father's parents, suffered from poverty. My father, Jungbei Lee, who was born as my grandparents' firstborn, grew up in that poverty. Grandfather's attempts in business had failed. He was going to horse races, their house leaked and had mice living in it, and they could not have proper meals. He remembers living in a tiny house with 11 people crammed into it. Obviously, it wasn't the ideal for growing up as a kid. My father still remembers when he was in elementary school and could not pay for the school fees. It was not much, but his family could not afford it. He recalls that he had to stay back after school on one cold winter day because he could not afford it. That day, his grandmother, who had been working at a marketplace, brought fur shoes that she got him to the school. Everyone else had been wearing the fur shoes already, but my dad was wearing thin rubber shoes in the freezing cold because he could not buy one. And to this day, he remembers the day that he got those fur shoes. From what you read, it should be clear that my dad and his family were extremely impoverished. Their financial circumstances were so desperate that his relatives told Grandma that he should not go to middle school, but should work right away after he graduates elementary school. I mentioned this in the last chapter, but my grandmother refused to do so and insisted that my dad go to middle and high school. Unbeknownst to her, my dad had heard the argument, and when she heard his mother insisting that he should go to middle school, he felt a responsibility to try his best in the chance given to him. Going to middle school and high school was not something granted like it was for me and probably you too. My dad knew that by sending him to school, the family was losing the chance to make more money. So to help the family in any possible way, my dad started to study hard so that he would be granted a scholarship for school. He tried his best in everything, and his efforts bore fruit in the promising grades and awards he received. He scored first in almost everything all throughout his middle school and high school days among hundreds of students. He studied without extra material outside of textbook, tutorings, big meals and snacks, or even a clean, quiet house for studying. He had rats darting around the ceiling, which leaked when it rained, and a tiny house crammed with all his family members. And yet, he did all he could to help himself and his family. Another reason he had tried so hard to get good grades was for college. He realized that he would need to get into a school with the lowest tuition possible, and the Seoul National University's tuition was half the tuition of private universities. However, SNU was, and is, the best college in South Korea. To make it even worse, his parents wanted him to get into the most competitive major at the school because it was easy to get a job if he graduated with the major. And so, he did everything he could to make sure he would get in, even with the lack of resources. What do you think was the result? Yes, he did get in. I hope you weren't looking for a shocking plot twist. In fact, he later earned a PhD in the field. He went from being a poor little kid who couldn't even have proper meals to earning a PhD in the nation's best university. My father's life is perhaps one of the best examples of rags to riches you find among your ancestors. Imagine being born and realizing that you have rats darting around your home and not having street meals being fed to you. It would certainly discourage me from even trying to succeed. But my father did not give up, gave his very best for his school, and actually succeeded in his goals. His life and struggles so blatantly show you how your surroundings should not be a justification for not trying. Giving up is not the correct option, no matter how difficult things may seem. Trying your best wouldn't always work out at once. However, you will eventually reach your dreams and your goals if you persist through the difficulties and endure, just like it did for my father. The lives of your and my ancestors in this book perhaps were not the stories of heroes and heroines you would read in fairy tales, but they were the heroes and heroines of their lives as they walked through the many trials they faced no matter how difficult and impossible they seemed. My grandparents and parents' generations were marred with war, poverty, and hardships. However, they still endured through it with God and got these priceless lessons that we can learn from. These stories and lessons are invaluable gifts from our ancestors that we should pass on for our descendants and ourselves to learn from them. And I hope that the lessons of this small booklet will make changes in the hearts of those who read it.